All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on a topic you're clearly fascinated by, autism spectrum disorder.
Definitely a fascinating area.
Yeah, and judging by all the notes and research papers and even AI summaries you sent over, you're really looking to get past just like the basics of autism, right?
It seems like you're looking for those connections, between genetics and the brain and the environment, and even some stuff on the evolution of autism. This should get us thinking.
Exactly. So let's start with, the foundation. Genes.
The building blocks.
Yeah, the building blocks. We hear autism is highly heritable, but what does that even mean?
Well, it means that something like 80% of the chance of developing autism can be tied back to your genes,
Okay.
but it's not as straightforward as it might sound.
Right.
There isn't one single autism gene you inherit. It's more about how lots of different genes interact with each other in a really complex way.
Gotcha. So it's not like inheriting, like, eye color or something.
All right, much more complex.
So are there any, key genes that researchers are focusing on right now?
Yeah, definitely. So one is FOXP2. That one's super important for language development and for social communication, and both of those can be affected by autism.
Uh-huh.
Then there's another one called ASHANK3, and that one plays a big role in how synapses form, those connections between brain cells.
So these genes, they are involved in some pretty important, brain stuff.
Fundamental stuff, yeah.
What makes them so important to understanding autism specifically?
Well, imagine you're building a house, right?
Right.
And you've got these blueprints. Now, even if the blueprints have little tiny variations in them, you can still probably build the house.
Uh-huh.
But maybe some of the rooms are a little bit off, or the doors stick a bit, or things just don't flow quite right.
Interesting.
Well, those genes we're talking about, they're kind of like part of the brain's blueprints.
I see.
And those little variations in those genes, they can affect how the brain is actually structured and how it functions.
That's a really cool way to think about it. It makes all those complicated genetics things a little easier to picture.
It's a helpful analogy.
Yeah. But, if we're talking about so many different genes, doesn't that make it super hard to find treatments that actually work?
Oh, absolutely. It's not like we can just target one single gene to fix things.
Right.
But even though it's hard, understanding these genes and what they do and how they interact, that's like the essential first step towards being able to develop better, more targeted therapies in the future.
So it's like laying the groundwork for a more personalized approach to treating autism.
Exactly. But genes are only one part of the picture.
Right.
We can't forget about the role that the environment plays. And that's where this thing called epigenetics comes in.
Okay, yeah, I remember learning about epigenetics in biology, but how does that relate to autism?
Think of your genes as a giant library full of all these books, right?
Hmm.
Each book has the instructions for building and running your body. Epigenetics are like the librarians who decide which books you can access, which ones stay locked away.
Huh, that's interesting.
And the cool thing is, environmental factors can actually influence those librarians, like turning certain genes on or off.
So even if you have a certain gene, whether it's actually doing something, can be affected by your environment?
Yeah, that's the idea. And this is where things get really interesting, because some things in the environment during pregnancy, like if the mother is really stressed or if she's exposed to certain chemicals, well, those things have been linked to a higher chance of autism.
Wow. So the environment can actually change how our genes are working even before we're born. That's amazing. And kind of scary, too.
It really shows how nature and nurture aren't two separate things. They're totally intertwined, influencing how the brain develops right from the start.
So speaking of the brain, I was looking at some of the research you sent, and it talks about how autistic brains have unique wiring patterns.
Right.
What's going on there?
Well, neuroimaging studies, they're basically like taking pictures of the brain.
Right.
Right. And they show that in autistic individuals, the connections between different parts of the brain, the synapses, are actually organized in a different way.
Interesting.
So in some areas of the brain, there might be too many connections, which could be why some people with autism are really sensitive to certain things in their environment.
Mm-hmm.
But then in other areas, there might not be enough connections. And that could be why some people struggle with, social communication or processing language.
So it's not like the brain is broken or anything. It's just wired differently.
Right. It has its own unique strengths and challenges.
And that kind of ties into this whole idea of neurodiversity, doesn't it?
Exactly. Neurodiversity really challenges that old view of autism as something that needs to be fixed. It's more about seeing those differences as just variations in how the human brain can work, each with its own unique advantages and disadvantages.
I like that way of looking at it. So could those differences in brain wiring actually explain some of the things that people with autism are really good at? Like, how some people can focus incredibly well, or they're amazing at spotting patterns.
Like a hot topic in research right now.
Yeah.
But there's definitely evidence that suggests those unique wiring patterns could be behind some of those remarkable abilities.
That makes sense.
And that leads us to this really interesting question. What if we look at autism through the lens of evolution? What would that tell us?
Okay, now this is where I think things are about to get really interesting.
Definitely.
Let's dive into that.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
When we start looking at autism through like an evolutionary lens, it makes us really reconsider some things.
Okay.
Like, maybe those autistic traits that we think of as deficits today, well, what if they were actually advantages back in the day in our ancestral past?
I'm all ears. What kind of traits are we talking about, and how could they have possibly been, beneficial back then?
Well, take heightened sensory perception, for example.
Oh.
You know how some autistic people are super sensitive to sounds or lights or textures? Well, in a world where your survival literally depended on picking up those tiny little cues in the environment, like the rustle of a predator or a change in the weather, that kind of sensitivity could have been like the difference between life and death.
So what we might see as sensory overload today, back then it was a superpower.
Yeah, it's a totally different way of looking at it, right?
Totally.
And think about the intense focus and attention to detail we often see in autistic individuals. Those traits, they could have been super valuable for mastering complex skills.
Like what?
I don't know, making tools or figuring out animal migration patterns.
It's like the things that make it harder to live in today's world. Those are the keys to success back then.
But that's the idea, yeah. And it really makes you think about how we define what's normal and how we view differences,
Absolutely.
If those traits were actually helpful way back when, what does that mean for how we approach autism now?
That's a deep question.
It is.
It really makes you rethink everything. But let's shift gears for a sec. I want to talk about something that's often really misunderstood.
What's that?
The connection between autism and intelligence.
Yeah.
The research you sent over suggests we've been underestimating the intellectual abilities of autistic people for a long time.
I think that's fair to say.
Are you saying that, the traditional IQ tests we use, they might not be showing us the whole picture when it comes to autistic intelligence?
Well, those traditional tests, they rely a lot on verbal skills and social interaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they usually have time limits.
Uh-huh.
And those are all areas where some autistic people struggle.
So you're saying just because someone scores lower on an IQ test, that doesn't mean they're not intelligent.
Exactly. It might just mean their strengths are in different areas that those tests aren't even measuring.
Right.
Research actually shows that autistic people often excel in visual spatial processing, recognizing patterns, and systemizing things.
Mm-hmm. So their ability to see patterns or understand how systems work, that's a type of intelligence.
Absolutely. And if we don't recognize those strengths, that can have serious consequences for people. Missed opportunities in school or work, all that stuff.
That's a good point. So how do all these different ways of thinking, these different ways of seeing the world, how do they affect how autistic people learn?
That's such an important question.
Right?
Because a classroom that works for a neurotypical kid, it might be a total nightmare for an autistic kid.
Yeah, totally.
Think about traditional classrooms, all that auditory learning, the social interaction, the rigid schedules, all that stuff can be super overwhelming for some autistic students.
It makes sense.
So the question is, how do we create learning environments that actually work for autistic kids?
How do we do that?
It starts by understanding that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right?
Yeah.
We need to move away from those standardized models and embrace individualized approaches.
Meaning
Meaning we got to cater to the specific strengths and challenges of each student.
So instead of trying to force autistic kids to learn like neurotypical kids, we need to build learning environments that celebrate their unique ways of thinking.
Exactly. And that's where things like using visual aids or having more hands-on learning or creating sensory-friendly spaces, all of that becomes really important.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Like, imagine a classroom where a kid who learns best visually can access information through diagrams and pictures.
Okay.
Or where a kid who needs to move around can fidget without getting in trouble.
Uh-huh.
Or where a kid who's sensitive to noise can go to a quiet corner to chill out.
That sounds amazing. But that's a big shift in how we think about education.
It is a big shift.
Like, it's moving away from that deficit-based model where we're always trying to fix what's wrong and moving towards a strengths-based approach where we celebrate neurodiversity.
That's the goal.
I like it. And that shift in thinking, it goes way beyond the classroom, right?
It does.
It's about building a whole society that values and includes autistic people.
Exactly. It's about seeing neurodiversity not as a burden, but as something valuable.
Yeah.
It's about making workplaces more accommodating and inclusive so autistic people can thrive and contribute their talents.
You know, we've talked a lot about the big picture stuff, genetics, evolution, education, all of that.
Yeah, we have.
But I kind of want to bring it down to a more personal level for a minute.
Okay.
What are some of the, day-to-day challenges that autistic people face?
One of the biggest ones is sensory overload, which we talked about a bit earlier.
Right.
Imagine experiencing the world with all your senses turned way up.
Oh, wow.
Everyday sounds, lights, textures, even smells, they can be just overwhelming, even painful sometimes.
That sounds really hard.
It can be?
Can you give me, a specific example of what that might feel like?
Sure. Imagine you walk into, a crowded mall during the holidays.
Yeah.
The lights are super bright. There's Christmas music blaring everywhere. People are talking and laughing. There's perfume samples in the air.
Yeah.
All those sensations hitting you all at once.
Yeah.
For someone with sensory sensitivities, that can feel like an attack on their whole system.
It makes me realize how much I take my own senses for granted, I just don't even think about it.
It's easy to forget.
So how can we help autistic people deal with sensory overload?
There are definitely things that can help.
Like what?
Some people find that deep pressure is really calming, like a weighted blanket or a tight hug.
Right.
Others find relief through repetitive movements,
Like what?
like rocking or spinning.
Interesting.
It's all about finding what works for each individual.
And I bet what works in one situation might not work in another situation, right?
Totally. It's good to have a bunch of different strategies to try.
And I'm guessing professional help like occupational therapy can also make a big difference.
Absolutely. Occupational therapists can help people create what's called a sensory diet.
What's that?
It's basically a personalized plan for managing sensory input throughout the day.
So like a roadmap for navigating the sensory world.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It helps people figure out what their triggers are and then come up with strategies for avoiding those triggers.
Okay.
Or coping with them when they can't be avoided.
Makes sense. So sensory overload, it's definitely a big challenge for lots of autistic people.
It is.
But, we've been focusing a lot on the challenges. I want to switch gears and talk about the strengths for a minute.
I like it.
Because as we've been discussing, autistic people often have amazing talents and abilities.
They do.
And one area where those strengths really shine is in pattern recognition, right?
Oh, absolutely. Autistic people, they often have this incredible ability to see patterns that neurotypical people just miss.
And that can be a huge advantage, right? Especially in fields like science, tech, engineering, math, all that stuff.
Totally. Those fields, they all require you to be able to see how complex systems work, to analyze data, to find patterns and trends. And those are all things that autistic individuals can be really, really good at.
So it's like a different way of thinking, a different way of processing information.
Exactly. And it's a way of thinking that can lead to major breakthroughs, real innovation.
Yeah.
And, there's this growing movement now to recognize the contributions of autistic people in those STEM fields.
Well, it's about time, right?
It is.
Like we're finally starting to appreciate those unique cognitive styles for what they are.
True.
Real assets.
Real assets.
Yeah.
And it's not just limited to, those intellectual fields either.
What do you mean?
Well, we see artistic people excelling in creative areas too.
Yeah.
Like art, music, writing.
Right.
Their ability to see the world differently, to think outside the box, it can lead to some seriously impressive stuff.
It really shows the power of neurodiversity.
It does.
These different ways of thinking, these different ways of experiencing the world, they can be incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. No matter what you're interested in, what field you're in, there's value there.
It makes you wonder how much potential is out there untapped because we haven't built a society that truly embraces neurodiversity.
Yeah, it's a big question. It shows how important it is to create a more inclusive world.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about the complexities, the challenges, the possibilities.
Definitely.
But if there's one thing I want people to take away from this conversation, it's this. Autism is not a deficit, it's a difference.
I like that.
And those differences, they can be a source of incredible strength, creativity, resilience.
Absolutely.
So let's wrap up this part of our deep dive, but we're not done yet. There's still more to explore, so come back for part 3, where we'll get into the importance of connection, the role of technology, and the ongoing journey toward a more inclusive future. And we're back for part 3 of our deep dive on autism.
Back at it.
We've covered a ton of ground already, from genes to evolution to, all the different ways autistic individuals experience the world. And we've even started to, question some of those old ideas about intelligence and what neurodiversity really means.
I think we've made some good progress.
But there's one more piece of this whole puzzle I want to look at.
Okay.
And it keeps popping up in the research you sent.
What is it?
It's this idea of connection.
Okay.
Or, maybe more accurately, the lack of connection that often happens between, autistic individuals and the neurotypical world.
It's definitely a key part of the autistic experience.
Yeah.
And, it can really impact someone's well-being and their quality of life.
Yeah.
The social challenges, the communication differences, that feeling of being misunderstood or like you don't belong, all of that can lead to feeling isolated and disconnected.
It makes you realize how much we depend on those social connections to feel like we belong. You know what I mean?
We really do.
So how can we bridge that gap? How do we make the world a place where autistic individuals feel more connected?
It's tough, but I think it starts with empathy. Really trying to see the world through autistic eyes.
Empathy, it's such a powerful word, but how do we actually do that? How do we move past our own assumptions and biases?
I think stories are a big part of it.
What do you mean?
Like listening to autistic people tell their own stories.
Uh-huh.
Hearing their experiences in their own words.
Yeah.
And letting ourselves be challenged by their perspectives.
So it's about opening ourselves up to different ways of being in the world.
Exactly. It's realizing that there isn't just one right way to experience things,
It makes you think.
It does.
Something that's really struck me during this deep dive is the incredible resilience of the autistic community.
Yeah, it is amazing.
I mean, despite all the challenges they face.
The misunderstandings, the barriers.
They keep advocating for themselves, building communities, creating art, making their voices heard.
They're amazing.
It's powerful, that ability to adapt and overcome.
And thrive, even when things are tough.
Exactly. And I think it reminds us that we all have a part to play in making the world more inclusive and equitable.
We do.
So where do we go from here? What are the next steps?
Well, the research points to a few important areas.
What do you mean?
Well, first, we've got to keep doing research.
Yeah, of course.
We need to keep learning more about the genetics and neurology of autism.
So basically understanding the biology better.
Yeah, but it's not just about the biology, right? We also have to think about the social and environmental factors that can make things harder or easier for autistic people.
So creating more sensory-friendly environments, building schools that are more inclusive.
Yeah, and workplaces, too.
That value neurodiversity.
Exactly. It's about creating a world that's more understanding and accepting of different ways of being.
And it's about recognizing that neurodiversity, it's not a bad thing.
It's not a burden.
It's a strength, it's creativity, it's innovation.
Well said.
One area where I see a ton of potential is technology. Technology can be such a game changer for communication and accessibility.
It can connect people in new ways.
And we're starting to see more and more inventions specifically designed for autistic individuals, right?
Absolutely. There are apps for communication, sensory-friendly products to help with overload.
Right.
Even virtual reality programs where people can practice social skills in a safe space.
It's exciting to think about how technology can, break down those barriers and create a more inclusive world.
It really is. But it's not just about the technology itself.
Right.
It's about using it in a way that empowers autistic individuals and helps them connect with others in meaningful ways.
That makes sense. So we've explored a lot in this deep dive, the complexities, the challenges, the possibilities.
We really have.
But if there's one thing I want our listeners to walk away with, it's this. Autism is not a deficit, it's a difference. And those differences can be sources of incredible strength and creativity and resilience.
I love that. It's about shifting our perspectives and embracing that beautiful diversity.
And Who knows? Maybe by embracing those differences, by learning from those different ways of seeing the world, we can create a future that's more inclusive, more innovative, and more compassionate for everybody.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of autism. I hope you learned some new things today, challenged some old assumptions, and maybe even walked away feeling inspired. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep embracing the beautiful complexity of being human.